In the chaos of war, some battles leave an unforgettable mark on history. Imagine the sheer devastation of losing 200 skilled pilots in a single confrontation, an event that shook Japan's military to its core. This wasn't just another skirmish. It was a turning point that signaled a major shift in the Pacific War. Air superiority was the backbone of Japan's military strategy during World War II. The Imperial Japanese Navy had trained its pilots to be among the finest in the world, and their early victories reflected that strength. But as the war progressed, the balance began to shift. The loss of such a significant number of experienced airmen in a single battle was more than a tactical defeat. It was a devastating blow to Japan's ability to sustain its air dominance. This moment forced Japanese military leaders to rethink their strategy, adapting to a war that was increasingly turning against them. It wasn't just about replacing aircraft, it was about replacing irreplaceable experience. The psychological and strategic impact of this loss would shape Japan's approach to air warfare for the rest of the war, setting the stage for desperate measures in the months to come. As Japan suffered devastating losses in the air, the United States was rapidly strengthening its aerial power. American pilots, equipped with cutting-edge aircraft like the P-38 Lightning, F-6F Hellcat, and F-4U Corsair, were gaining the upper hand. These planes were faster, more durable, and heavily armed, designed to outmatch Japanese aircraft in dogfights. The Hellcat, in particular, became a nightmare for Japanese pilots, boasting an impressive kill ratio that helped turn the tide of the Pacific War. Beyond superior aircraft, American forces had a technological advantage that Japan struggled to counter. Radar systems played a crucial role in detecting incoming enemy formations, allowing U.S. pilots to intercept Japanese aircraft before they could strike. Intelligence gathering also improved, with code breakers deciphering Japanese communications, giving American commanders critical insight into enemy movements. These advantages ensured that U.S. pilots often entered battles with the upper hand, setting traps and launching preemptive strikes. Another key factor in America's dominance was pilot training. Unlike Japan, which focused on elite training for a select few, the U.S. established a large-scale pilot training program to create a steady supply of skilled aviators. Japanese pilots who perished in battle were nearly impossible to replace, while American airmen underwent rigorous training programs that emphasized survival, teamwork, and adaptability. The difference in training philosophies became more apparent as the war dragged on. Japan's pool of experienced pilots dwindled, while the U.S. continued to produce highly trained aviators ready for battle. This shift in air superiority reshaped the war in the Pacific, leading to more decisive American victories. One battle in particular stands out as a turning point in the Pacific War, an engagement so one-sided that it would later be known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. This massive aerial confrontation took place during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, where Japan launched a desperate attempt to stop the advancing American fleet. Instead, it suffered one of the most crushing defeats in aviation history, losing nearly 200 highly trained pilots in a single day. The battle began with Japan deploying over 400 aircraft from its carriers, hoping to overwhelm the U.S. Navy with sheer numbers. However, American forces were prepared. Using superior radar systems, they detected the incoming wave of Japanese planes well in advance. U.S. fighter pilots took to the skies, forming a deadly defensive screen. As the enemy squadrons approached, Hellcats and Corsairs swooped in, tearing through Japanese formations before they could even reach the American fleet. The Japanese, caught off guard, struggled to mount an effective counterattack. Many of their pilots, less experienced than their predecessors, found themselves outmatched by the well-trained Americans. The difference in aircraft performance also played a role. The heavily armored Hellcats could absorb damage and keep fighting, while Japan's lighter Zero fighters were easily shot down. By the end of the battle, American pilots had obliterated Japanese air power, sinking multiple enemy aircraft carriers and leaving Japan with no choice but to retreat. This crushing loss was more than just a defeat. It crippled Japan's ability to wage effective air warfare for the rest of the war. The once dominant Imperial Japanese Navy had been stripped of its best pilots, and with no way to replace them, Japan's Air Force was never the same again. This battle marked the beginning of the end for Japan's aerial ambitions in the Pacific. Japan's devastating losses in this battle were not just the result of a single engagement, but a culmination of deep-rooted issues that had been building throughout the war. One of the biggest factors was the loss of experienced pilots. At the start of the war, Japan's Air Force was considered among the best in the world, with highly trained aviators who had mastered dogfighting tactics. However, Japan's strategy focused on training a small number of elite pilots rather than developing a large pool of skilled replacements. As these veterans were gradually lost in combat, there were no experienced pilots to take their place. By the time of this battle, Japan was sending inexperienced recruits into combat against well-trained American pilots, leading to disastrous results. Another major problem was outdated tactics. Japanese pilots had been trained for aggressive close-range dogfighting, which worked well early in the war, but became ineffective against America's evolving air strategy. The U.S. had developed superior aerial formations and tactics, such as the thatch weave, which allowed American pilots to support each other in combat, making it much harder for Japanese fighters to score kills. While Japan continued to rely on outdated one-on-one duels, American squadrons fought as coordinated units, giving them a huge advantage in large-scale battles. Technological superiority also played a crucial role. The Japanese Zero fighter, once feared for its speed and maneuverability, had fallen behind in performance compared to American aircraft like the Hellcat and Corsair. Unlike the fragile Zero, American planes had armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and powerful weapons, making them more durable and deadly. Additionally, radar systems allow the U.S. to detect incoming attacks early, while Japan had no such advantage. This meant American pilots often entered battles with better positioning, greater firepower, and a clearer picture of the enemy's movements. These factors combined to create a scenario where Japan was simply outmatched. With a dwindling number of skilled pilots, ineffective battle tactics, and aircraft that could no longer compete, Japan suffered devastating losses that it could never recover from. The battle was not just a defeat, it was the moment when Japan's air power was permanently broken. The aftermath of this battle sent shockwaves through Japan's military and political leadership. The loss of nearly 200 trained pilots in a single engagement was a devastating blow that Japan simply could not afford. High-ranking officials in the Imperial Japanese Navy were forced to confront a harsh reality. Air superiority, once a key strength, had crumbled. With so many experienced aviators gone, Japan's ability to launch large-scale air attacks was severely weakened. Some leaders pushed for desperate measures, including accelerated pilot training and more aggressive defensive tactics. But these efforts came too late to change the course of the war. The decline of the Japanese Air Force became evident in the months that followed. Unlike the United States, which had a massive training program, producing skilled pilots at an industrial scale, Japan lacked a system to quickly replace its fallen veterans. With each battle, their air units became weaker, relying on inexperienced recruits who had little combat training. As American forces continued to push closer to Japan, the situation grew even worse. Planes were available, but there were no seasoned pilots left to fly them effectively. This led to Japan's increasing reliance on desperate tactics, such as kamikaze attacks, where pilots were sent on suicide missions in a final attempt to slow down the American advance. This battle marked a major turning point in the war. With Japanese air power effectively shattered, the U.S. gained complete control of the skies, making it nearly impossible for Japan to defend itself against air raids and naval bombardments. This shift allowed American forces to press forward, launching devastating attacks on Japanese-held islands, and eventually the home islands themselves. The loss of air superiority not only crippled Japan's military strategy, but also weakened morale among both soldiers and civilians. It became clear that victory was no longer within reach, and, for Japan, the road to ultimate defeat had been set in motion. Behind the statistics of this devastating battle were the lives of the pilots who fought in the skies, many of whom never returned. Among the Japanese aviators were men who had once been among the finest pilots in the world, trained in an era when Japan's Air Force reigned supreme. Some had fought since the early days of the war, witnessing the tide turn against them with each passing year. One such pilot, Lieutenant Jiro Sato, had written to his family just days before the battle, expressing doubts about Japan's chances, but vowing to fight to the end. He never returned, lost in the chaos of aerial combat, his fate mirroring that of hundreds of his fellow airmen. For the few Japanese pilots who survived, the battle was nothing short of a nightmare. Some who managed to eject or crash land at sea were later rescued, only to report that they had never seen such destruction before. A young pilot, Ensign Takeshi Mori, later recalled that the sky had been filled with flames and smoke, with American planes cutting through their formations effortlessly. Many of his comrades, barely trained and thrown into combat with only the most basic flight skills, were shot down before they even had a chance to engage. The realization that their fleet's air power had been shattered in a single day was devastating. On the American side, the pilots who fought in this battle understood the scale of what had happened. Some, like Commander David McCampbell, a Navy ace, described the battle as almost surreal. American pilots had long respected Japan's Air Force. But on that day, they saw a desperate enemy sending waves of inexperienced aviators into battle, only to be easily cut down. Some American pilots, despite their victories, later reflected on the tragedy of it all, how the battle had signaled the end of an era for Japanese aviation, and how the young men they had fought against had been sent into a hopeless fight. The human cost of the battle extended beyond the cockpit. Families in Japan waited for news that never came, as hundreds of pilots failed to return. The defeat was more than just a strategic loss. It was a moment that symbolized the fading strength of an air force that had once seemed invincible. For both sides, it was a battle that would never be forgotten. The staggering loss of 200 trained pilots in a single battle sent Japan into a state of desperation. For years, the Imperial Japanese Navy had relied on its elite airmen to challenge American forces in the Pacific. But now, with most of them gone, Japan faced an impossible situation. The Air Force had been crippled beyond recovery, and the war effort was crumbling under relentless U.S. advances. With no way to match American air superiority, Japan's military leaders began to consider extreme measures. This led to the birth of one of the most infamous tactics of the war: kamikaze attacks. The reaction among the Japanese public was one of shock and sorrow. Families received devastating news that their sons, husbands, and brothers had been lost in a single overwhelming defeat. The once invincible image of Japan's military was shattered, and many began to question whether victory was still possible. Propaganda efforts increased, urging citizens to remain loyal and sacrifice for the empire. But beneath the surface, fear and doubt were spreading. The government responded by intensifying nationalist rhetoric, portraying fallen pilots as heroes and calling for an even greater commitment to the war effort. With no experienced pilots left, Japan made a drastic shift in its aerial strategy. Traditional dogfighting and precision bombing were no longer possible, so military leaders turned to suicide attacks as a last resort. By late 1944, Japan had begun forming kamikaze units, young, barely trained pilots who were ordered to crash their planes into enemy ships. The transition from skilled aerial combat to desperate suicide missions marked a turning point in Japan's strategy, showing just how hopeless their situation had become. What had once been an air force known for its skill and discipline was now reduced to throwing untrained recruits into one-way attacks. This psychological shift was one of the most significant consequences of the battle. It was no longer about winning, but about inflicting as much damage as possible before inevitable defeat. For Japan, the loss of its air superiority didn't just change military tactics. It signaled the beginning of the end. This battle was more than just a devastating defeat for Japan. It was the moment when its air force, once feared across the Pacific, fell into irreversible decline. The loss of 200 trained pilots in a single engagement shattered Japan's ability to wage effective aerial warfare. From that point on, American forces would dominate the skies, striking at will and accelerating Japan's path to defeat. What had once been a war of skilled dogfights turned into a desperate struggle for survival, with Japan resorting to kamikaze attacks as its last resort. The battle serves as a brutal reminder of the realities of war. Air combat played a decisive role in shaping the outcome of World War II, demonstrating how technological superiority, training, and strategy could change the course of history. For the men who fought in the skies, whether American or Japanese, it was a fight for their lives. And, for many, it was their last. The destruction in the air mirrored the larger devastation of the Pacific War, where entire nations were drawn into a conflict that reshaped the world. The impact of this battle still resonates today. It stands as a testament to the importance of air power in modern warfare and serves as a lesson in the cost of war. Understanding these battles helps us appreciate the sacrifices made and the strategic decisions that shaped history. If you're interested in learning more, exploring the stories of these pilots and the battles they fought can provide a deeper understanding of World War II and the incredible role air combat played in its outcome.